Good morning, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's online event, UCD After MVP, How to Leverage User-Centered Design for Every Release. Today, we're joined by VMware Pivotal Labs designer, Danny Sandoval. This is an interactive session, so please feel free to ask us anything using the Q&A box below the presentation screen. We'll do our best to answer all the questions live, but if you don't have any time at the end, we will respond via email. This session is also unique because we will be answering questions in the middle of the session, so please feel free to ask us questions throughout the entire presentation. Now, without further ado, let's hand this off to Danny. Danny?
Thanks, AJ. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Y'all should see it in just a moment. All right, there we go. And we're gonna have captions on there at the bottom. So if anybody is hard of hearing, you should be able to see pretty close to what I'm saying. And so, yeah, thanks y'all for hanging out with us today. I'm excited to share with you some of the techniques that we use at VMware Pivotal Labs to evaluate the success of our solutions as our clients go from MVP all the way to iterating in production. And we do this through user-centered design techniques, so that way the applications that we're building really do incorporate both the user's desires as well as what the best thing is for the business. And so quickly, I'll just go over what we'll be talking about today. In just a moment, I'll cover kind of baseline what user-centered design is, just as a short introduction, and really when an MVP is considered viable. How do we measure it? What do we do up front? And how do we make sure that by the time we release something, we know what our measures of success look like? Then I'll be going into what I call the smells of good enough, which are techniques that you can use no matter how instrumented your solution is with analytics to quickly get a gut feeling for what your MVP should look like and whether or not it's time to move on. Then, as AJ mentioned, we'll be going into a short Q&A section where we can talk about any of the issues that maybe you and your team have run into, either using these techniques or trying to forego using them. And then we'll dive into what to build after MVP, where we cover some of the techniques that we use at VMware Pivotal Labs to evaluate the next step and really converge on a solution that's best for the users as well as for the business. And so let's start with the basics. Let's cover what UCD is. And essentially, you can see here a learn, build, measure loop. This is something that you might have seen in the lean startup, as well as just across the software industry. This cycle allows for us to quickly iterate between the idea that we have, the thing that we build to test it, and then the measurements that we use to make sure that we actually ended up building the right thing. And as you can see, all of that is centered around the user. So that way we can move forward in a way that's iteratively focused on the things that our customers actually need. But as it says on the screen, y'all probably already knew that. At VMware Pivotal Labs, we also kind of layer on top of this what's called a discovery and framing process, where at the beginning of a project, we'll actually do some problem discovery, where we use that same learn, build, measure loop, but focused on the many problems that maybe users have and prioritizing them in a way that allows for us to get to a problem that we think is the most valuable to work on first. Then we go off and frame our solutions by going wide and generating lots of different ways that we could approach this problem. And then prioritizing with our stakeholders and our team to create a user-centered solution that actually meets the business needs and goals for that engagement. Then, as you can see there, development really starts. And so this discovery and framing process can happen in a number of days and allows for us to quickly get to a place where we're shipping working software to continuously research and see in production what our users actually need day to day. And so through these iterations, we end up learning a lot more about our users than we would in any amount of upfront design. And that's because when you actually ship something to an end user and see them use it in production, you end up in a situation where you're learning how people actually use software in context, and you get to a product that's a lot less risky and a lot better for the business and for the users. And so we asked ourselves many times towards the middle of our engagements, what user-centered design looks like here in that second and third iteration. When you've looked at your minimum viable product and you realize, wow, this really is the bare minimum. There's a lot more we can do here. And so what does user-centered design look like here? That's really what we'll dive into in this part of the webinar. So The one way to answer the question of when a minimum viable product is really viable is to ask your roadmap, how is your team measuring success? And you may have seen this as a road mapping solution. It's what's called a Gantt chart. And as you can see, there's some projects, some priorities, and they're all lined up in a time series. And that's great and all, but let's zoom in a little bit further at what a lot of companies have, which is these like product specifications. And here you can see a screenshot of our fake solution that we'll be coming up with and using today, which is our laundry experience MVP. And here you can see just a big list of requirements and some user interaction designs, maybe, as well as the background and strategic fit and goals of the engagement. What we like to use at VMware Pivotal Labs is what's called an outcome-oriented roadmap, which is similar to what you see in the Confluence page in the sense that it does outline the goals and the success criteria, but it also outlines some of the integrations and features that might exist as well. And what these two things have in common is the success criteria that's aligned with the goals of the particular project. And as you can see blurred out in that Gantt chart, that's something that those time series types of graphs are really missing, and allows for us to zoom in and look at, have we met our success criteria? And when you're trying to figure out whether or not to move on from the first few features in your minimum viable product, you really need to make sure that you're answering this question. Because if you don't, well, you haven't actually completed your MVP. You're still in that iteration phase, learning from your customers and trying to figure out, have we met the success criteria? Can we do this better? And so for our hypothetical example, we'll go ahead and use the success criteria for this new folding close method that we've created. Essentially, the success criteria is that 100% of close are folded using our new method. The amount of time spent folding close by our users goes from 120 minutes maybe to 15 minutes. And then one thing that we also highlighted on the success criteria is how we're going to measure it, which I think is important to analyze up front, because it allows for us to identify what tools we're actually going to be using in production when we actually are measuring the user interactions day to day. And so when you've measured this and you've learned whether or not you've met your success criteria, it's time to either build, iterate, get to a place where you actually can successfully say, yes, we met that success criteria, it's time to move on. Or gather enough data to prove that it's impossible. These success criteria are a best guess, and there are many times when the guess that you have, the context that you think the users exist within, actually may have shifted from underneath your feet. And in those situations, it's okay to say that we did our best, and it's time to move on to the next most valuable thing. Nothing is worse than iterating on something that really doesn't have as much much tangible value when you could be moving to work on something that users actually need, or your business needs to succeed. And so one thing that I notice happens quite a bit, especially if you're used to more upfront design, is actually using prototypes to try to have this same cycle. And that can be valuable, most definitely, especially in more risky situations where this build, measure, learn loop might lead to a very scary situation. That being said, don't be afraid to just ship it and to measure things in your working software. Because like I stated at the beginning, it's really hard to guess how users will actually use things in production. It's only the only best way to do it is to actually ship something and learn from that, as opposed to spending all of your time in prototype land. And so let's talk about analytics, which for many companies is the easiest way to measure something in production. When you are shipping something, you tend to also want to instrument each of those features or other types of user interactions with analytics tools. These analytics tools can be super helpful to allow for an individual click or an individual piece of your funnel to actually mean something in your day-to-day stand-ups when you're actually looking to see whether or not this project was a success. You can point to conversion rates, you can point to click-throughs, and you can say, okay, this proves that X, Y, or Z. And if you admitted up front that was part of your success criteria, you can definitely use that as a way to prove that it's time to move on. But analytics doesn't also tell the whole story. There are other ways to measure your working software as well. And sometimes this can be very valuable in situations where a complete aggregate of your population even sorted by demographics, can't tell the whole story. And so one way to do this is usability testing, which allows for you to zoom in on a particular interaction and ask users who maybe represent a specific part of your population, and ask them to go through a number of tasks to validate that the thing that you're shipping actually does improve their lives. And so you can have a baseline metric that maybe from using the software beforehand, they now have a new MVP that you've shipped to actually measure whether or not that was an improvement. You can use that as a success criteria, and you can move forward with a positive, usable piece of software. Another way to do this is you use in-app surveys, which allows for you to, at the end of a task, ask a question whether or not it was valuable or helpful for that user, and kind of get some extra qualitative information of that as well. In-depth interviews are another way to follow up in these situations where, let's say, a particular task was complete. You can also recruit from that, and allow for your team to ask more in-depth questions when quantitative metrics aren't enough. An even more in-depth way of doing this is actually diary studies, where you end up asking a group of users who represent your population to go through using your application on a normal day-to-day basis, and then write down at the end of the day how that went. So why they actually wanted to use your application, what made them happy while they were using it, what made them sad, and with this information, really aggregate whether or not your product is meeting the needs of your users outside of whether or not they're actually clicking on the button. Because there could be another story underneath these individual interactions, and these more qualitative measurements allow for you to get that story and even evaluate, the positive and negative criteria that maybe is in your success criteria. Finally, first click testing is a great way to kind of sum up at a very aggregate level some of the things that you might find in a usability test. And so if you can't get the time or funding to do these more qualitative research methods, you can rely on something more like first click testing if really just speed of interaction is something that your product is trying to provide. And so with this, you end up in a situation where you have a lot of awesome tools to use to measure the success of your MVP. But at the same time, we may end up in a situation where these aren't enough. And especially in earlier products, you may not have a fully instrumented analytics solution, or you may have this feeling that even after we do a week's worth of research, we may not know the same amount that we think we know right now. And so what I like to do is cover the smells of good enough, where you can actually have a gut feeling as to whether or not you should be doing more research on this particular part of your solution, or if you should zoom out and reevaluate and ask yourselves, what should we build next? If you're in any of these situations, now would be a good time to take a step back and look at your product critically and see if you can find the next most valuable thing. So this first situation is what I call too many iterations with too little return on investment. And here you can see an example that may be great for a multivariate or A/B test, but maybe a situation where actually users don't really care one way or the other. And the way you can tell is if coming back from your analytics or from your qualitative research, you end up with a very, very small difference between all of these different methods of doing something. This tends to happen more in the prototype stage, but can also happen in production. And so when you find no significant differences between many options, sometimes it's best to just pick one and move on. In addition, one thing that we see often at VMware Pivotal Labs is when teams have a super narrow focus and they try to optimize for the local maxima when there's bigger fish to fry. And so let's go back to our laundry example, where maybe you have an entire laundry cycle, which is maybe 45 minutes for washing, 90 minutes for drying, and 120 minutes for folding clothes. This is a significant amount of time to fold clothes. And whether or not you're watching Netflix while you do it, certainly could be shortened. So here, we may have improved that. Let's say our first release, we got it down from 120 minutes to 15. It's pretty great. But if we were to keep optimizing this, heck, even if we got this down to below 90 minutes, we end up in a situation where we're no longer optimizing the entire scope of the solution. Instead, we're optimizing for what we're calling the local maxima, which means that no matter how many times we wash the clothes or how many loads we get through the dryer, we're going to end up in a situation where we're out of clothes to fold because the dryer is still stuck at 90 minutes. And so in this case, it's probably time to move on to the next most valuable thing instead of trying to figure out how to optimize the clothes folding solution. Now, you may think my team never does this, but it certainly happens all the time. A perfect example of this is when you have a team who's designing a version of a page and they say, look, we've sped up our user's workflow from 5 seconds to 3 seconds. That's great. But if the entire page takes 10 seconds to load, you may need to go back and take a look at whether or not that's the thing you should be solving right now instead of a particular part of the workflow that maybe you're continuing to optimize despite very little return on investment. Now, the final reason that you may want to take a step back and reevaluate and ask what's the next most valuable thing is if you've been asked by stakeholders to work on a different user need or a larger portfolio goal. Now, this can happen for a number of reasons. One is you may just have new users to support, and it's time to incorporate their needs into your same solution. In addition, your users may have new needs that maybe you hadn't acknowledged in the past or have come up since you've released your first piece of working software. And then finally, your team or the teams around you's roadmap may have changed. And even if there is more work to do on your minimum viable product, there certainly is an opportunity to go outside of that and to work on those more, exterior maximas instead of the local maxima. And so at this point, I'd like to open up the floor for questions because there's been a lot going on so far, mostly around measuring the success of your application. And since we're going to be moving into the next portion of this webinar, which is choosing what to work on next, I want to make sure we have time to really open the floor for questions around whether or not our product is in fact viable, and it's time to move on to the next thing. So I see a question coming in here. Go ahead and open that up. And so the first question here is, what if you don't have a designer on your project? How do you do the user research? Okay, so that's a good question. I think what this question tells me is that there is a lot of research that needs to get done, as I really showed earlier in the deck, and sometimes it can be a little nerve-wracking to feel like you have this laundry list of user research when you just want to ship product and you want to get to a place where your application is used by, let's say, hundreds, thousands, millions of people. That being said, the more users that you have, the more impact that your application has, across the world. And so in that situation, it's really important that someone puts on the hat of user research, even if it's not a specific designer. And as I mentioned before in the tools of user research, you can use just analytics, but it's not going to give you that full picture. And so what I'd recommend you do if you don't have the resources for a designer or a dedicated researcher is to take the time to make a list of questions and then prioritize them as what you think is the most riskiest thing if you did not answer it. And so if you have a list of questions, let's say, why are users still not clicking through to this particular part of our application, or what's the deal with this whole section of our application? People seem to just be completely abandoning it halfway through the workflow. In those situations, like that might be a pretty risky set of questions that you should get answered first. It might be lower than questions like, how do users feel when they're using our application? That might be something that maybe is not as risky and you can deprioritize. In which case, I would recommend going back to that list of different research tools and picking the one that best fits the particular question that you have. And so if it's more of a question based on a particular workflow, you might use like a usability study, you might use a in-depth interview to kind of dive into that. And if it's more of a question around let's say the context of use, like everything that people are doing before and after using the application, you might also rely on in-depth interviews, and you can do that as a product manager, certainly, or as an engineering leader even. And you can leverage those in-depth interviews in addition to using things like more qualitative testing applications like prototyping. All right, so this next question is, how do you measure if a product is joyful, not just viable? That's a great question. I think there was one method that I mentioned around diary studies that I think is a great thing to leverage, and I don't think it leveraged enough, in my opinion. I think that joyful is definitely could be one success criteria that you have as a team. And I think it's something that people should really be attentive to early on in their product development. When you are going into an MVP, try to challenge the team to ask critically, what is minimum in this particular situation? Is minimum purely just it does the things that we need it to do? If the answer is yes, then that's great. But more than likely, there are competitors in your particular field. There are, other workflows that people have today, maybe that they're willing to deal with, and like that they're duct taping together, that could actually be more joyful, to use this question's term, than the thing that you've experienced. And so in that case, joyfulness is a competitive advantage, right? And I think that's one thing that, especially if you're a designer and you're asking this question, you need to make sure that you kind of bring to the table, because good design on its own is not something that happens in a vacuum. It happens collaboratively across all sorts of disciplines on the team. And so if you can't convince the product manager that joyful is going to be a competitive advantage, or is going to make you more money, or is going to keep users in terms of retention, then you don't really have an opportunity to have that conversation and measure those things. But I think if you can get up front and you can ask to incorporate those things into the measures of success, because in fact, by making something joyful in this case, and it could be many number of qualities, not just joyful. It could be stable. It could be make someone like say focused, right? That could be a great way to really establish your product as a competitor to other products in the field that maybe would have a higher retention, or higher what's the opposite of retention? Attrition. So are there any more questions before we move on to the next session? These are great questions, and I certainly love hearing them. There will also be an opportunity for questions at the end, so I want to make sure that's it. All right. So moving on, we have this question, which is, what do we build after MVP? You may be asking me, that's great, Danny. I'm really glad that we all agreed that the thing that we shipped is good enough. But now I need to know what to do next, because otherwise my roadmap is just a bunch of bug fixes, which is certainly one thing to work on. But usually there's a opportunity to really deliver a lot more business value, and kind of thinking as your next release as another discovery phase. And so going back to that learn, build, measure loop, if you've measured and it's a success, you ended up with an application that your users enjoy, that's met your success criteria, you've gotten the laundry folding thing down to your target of 15 minutes. Well, it's time to learn once again what users need. And in all reality, the context has changed because you've changed it, right? By releasing your software, you've actually created a situation where people are using something differently. They're thinking about things differently. If you've done your job as a software developer, you've actually changed the world in a way where people who are using your software now have new pain points. They have new goals because you've solved one of their problems. And so what I ask for you to do is return to your outcome-oriented roadmap, where this first column is everything that you just worked on, right? It's that first release. You've reduced time spent folding and putting away clothes, and that outcome has been met by the features that you built. So new and improved clothes folding process, great, you shipped it. But if you look here, there's another feature where the instructions and training material for clothes folding, let's say, was also originally part of this release. And so as we were going, through the build, measure, learn loop, it may be very possible that we got to the success criteria without building all of these features. And so you can see how you can get to an MVP before going through your laundry list, pun intended, of features. And because of that, you can actually end up not only saving time and energy and money, but really getting to a place where you're actually moving on to the next release because of the user-centered design methods, as opposed to building up a huge list of features that you have to implement in order for release one to be done. So looking back on that last half of this presentation, you can actually see that we got to release one hypothetically much earlier than we would have had we just planned an entire release up front and then shipped it and then moved on. By making a release outcome oriented and measured with success criteria, we can move on to release 2, knowing that we've actually completed release 1, not because we've checked off all the features, but because we've met our users' needs. And so to ask the question, how might we evaluate what to build after MVP? I'd argue to track your assumptions. And if you haven't done this already in your first release, now would be a good time to go back and list out everything that you assume going in. And what an assumptions tracker allows for you to do is it allows for you to kind of list out everything that kind of the context that your users exist within. And these could be assumptions like our users believe X, or our users will do Y. And then you actually go and test that through these qualitative testing or through for instance, click tracking and analytics. And when you do that, you can actually see how your assumptions change over time. And so when you revisit those in the future, you can say, okay, well, based on how people are using it now, let's actually go back and watch recordings of our previous interviews, for instance, or let's go back and look at our analytics over the course of the last 4 months and see how these assumptions have changed over time. Because it's very possible that what was a maybe secondary or tertiary pain point going into your first release, maybe now is the most important thing because they've kind of like gotten to a place where it's almost like when you go to a massage and you kind of get that first kink massaged out. Now you're in a situation where everything else that used to not hurt very much now is the thing that's the most painful. And users kind of have that same feeling when they are using your product and finally have that biggest pain point solved. So go back and watch your recordings and see if any of these things bubble up. Things that maybe you weren't prioritizing in the past because they weren't the biggest pain point could very well be the most important thing now today. And then finally, what I'd argue for you to do is to generate new assumptions, questions, and hypotheses, and go and test these again. The learn loop doesn't have to just be something that is focused on success metrics that you can measure in your application. The learn part of the learn loop can also be focused on pulling data out of existing contexts and out of new things that you believe to be true. And so you can go and you can talk to your users once again and ask them, now that you have thing that you've built, what's next, what's changed, what are you feeling today, and you can see if you believe that you've actually solved these problems or if you've just created new ones. And so at Pivotal Labs, VMware Pivotal Labs, we use 2x2s to kind of track these things against one another. So what you saw before was like a linear set of assumptions. Everything's stacked on top of each other. They're all neutral. They're all basically the same priority. But when you actually write things down that you hear from user research, that you see in issues with like your analytics and your funnels, you can actually track them on basically a 2x2 axis, where you can basically put anything you want on these 2x2s. At the very top, you have perhaps important to the business being one axis and important to the users being another. And what you do as a team, and involve as many stakeholders as you can in this process as well, is you plot the things that you're hearing, through your analytics tools, through your customer support software, any piece of data that aggregates up to a pain point or a goal, you can plot on this axis. And what you do is you force rank them one over the other, first on the vertical axis, then on the horizontal axis. And what you'll get to is something like this, where you've got maybe multiple axes that kind of plot things differently. And on the left side, you have your first group of axes. In this case, we have the same laundry example. Reducing time spent folding is in that upper right-hand corner, which is good because that's the thing that we built first. As you go down from the upper right, you end up kind of seeing a prioritized list of, first, we're going to do reduce time folding, then we're going to reduce the wash cycle, then we're going to speed up the drying cycle, and so on. Here we have teach kids how to do laundry. As you can see, not very important to the business and apparently not very important to the users. But with that sorted list, you can see how that gets transferred over to the bang column. And bang in this case is really just like a priority. Once again, it's that important to the business and important to the users aggregated up in, see if I can move my mouse around, I can, to the like 1, 2, 3, 4. You can see how they're all stacked ranked. But what this right 2x2 has is really the developer's perspective as well. And so rather than just focusing on what's going to bring the most business value, what's going to bring the most user value, we can also incorporate things like how much is this going to cost? Like something that's a higher buck, something that maybe takes a lot of refactoring, takes a lot of rebuilding, requires us to completely change the way we do laundry. Apparently, that might be a higher cost. Whereas things that are lower cost, for instance, doesn't require us to make any machine. We just have to teach people something. That would be on the right side. And so you can see how with this, it was very easy for us in our first release to choose reduce time spent folding and putting away clothes. But now that we've gotten to the second release, we realize that speeding up the time to, for instance, the wash cycle, that might be a little bit more difficult of a choice because our developers told us, well, that's actually kind of expensive. We have to go and re-implement how we do washing for our example. Now, what's important at this point in time, when you've looked at your MVP, you've established that you're moving on to the next most valuable thing. It's important that you also don't base your next step on assumptions that you made before you released your MVP. And so, once again, bring your developers into the room. And if you are a developer, ask to be included in these types of conversations, because when you are close to the code and you're seeing the day-to-day changes as you ship your first release, the assumptions that you made up front may no longer be true, and vice versa. And so you end up in a situation where perhaps speeding up the wash cycle is really not as hard as you thought. And so, looking over at the development x-axis, we may, when asking once again, kind of change our assumptions because we've learned so much more. It turns out speeding up the wash cycle a lot easier than we thought. And teaching kids how to do laundry, well, when we first started working on things, teaching kids was the same as teaching anybody else. Super easy, not that big of a deal. Now that we've tried it once or twice, turns out teaching kids how to do laundry is very costly. So we're moving that to the complete left-hand side of the axis. And you can see here how our releases, which were maybe outlined more around, okay, what's the cheapest thing that also gives user value, that's going to be speeding up the wash cycle. We may want to change based on the answers to this. So in this case, it may not be as complex as we thought. Let's go ahead and shift it over. And now we've got a new set of releases. And so thinking of your next release as your next discovery phase allows for us to reevaluate some of the things that we've learned over the course of shipping our MVP and not move ahead in assumptions that we've made up front. And this is kind of the basis of all of agile software development. This build, measure, learn loop helps us incorporate new insights and new data as we translate our ideas into working software, our working software into measurements of success, and our measurements of success into learnings that we can apply to our next iteration of working software. And so what we covered today was how to tell when to move on from your product's MVP using very really well-defined success criteria and measuring tools that are quantitative and qualitative that we use at VMware Pivotal Labs. In addition, we learn how to revisit past research and assumptions to decide on what to work on next. And whether you figured out that it was time to move on from very well-defined success criteria or just the gut feeling, deciding on what to work on next is going to be instrumental to building something that is not only valuable to your users, but also is the most valuable to your business. And so what this does is it saves your team from wasting time iterating on a solution that's already good enough. And when you've done that, you end up solving the problems that your users really need to solve without wasting the time and energy and money, solving the problems that perhaps you've already solved and success criteria can help you define. And so with that, I'd like to hand it back over to AJ to close us out and maybe open up for some more questions.
Great. Thank you, Danny, for today's presentation. We do have some time here at the end to answer some questions, so please use the questions box below your presentation screen to ask us anything. I think there are a few people typing here. There we go. So, Danny, we do have a question that just came in, and I can read it out for you.
That'd be great.
What happens when you have a bunch of features planned and designed, but you've already met your success criteria? What do you propose doing with those features?
Gotcha. So I talked a little bit about this when we first saw our outcome-oriented roadmap, when we had that list of features that was in release 1. And I think this can be really hard for designers. I think personally, as a designer, I can feel this, where you spend all this time figuring out what to build up front. And whether it's a day or 2 weeks, like that time feels valuable. But at the end of the day, the design that you're generating and the design that you're creating really is only going to be viable if it's good for the user and for the business. And so in these situations where you have a release that's already met the success criteria, well, it's very possible, as this question asked, that the features that you were building may not be all the features that you designed. And so in those situations, I'd look for opportunities later on in the roadmap to align those designs with success criteria. And so you may see that, like, coming up in the next part of the roadmap, that there's some success criteria that really aligns with some of the features maybe you had planned for release 1 as a designer. And so pick those out and figure out how to reincorporate those into those more iterative slices of releases. And you'll end up probably getting those features a lot earlier than trying to fight for those features that are valued just on their own. If you can kind of tack them on to things that will work for the business as well, you're going to end up having a lot more alignment across the team, and you won't feel like you're trying to push a rock uphill.
Great. We do have another question here. How do you do all of this if the users are not easily accessible and getting feedback from them cannot be done in a timely manner?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think that's why I covered analytics first, because I think they're like a boon for people who need feedback. If you're able to instrument your application as early as possible, you can get some of that baseline understanding of what your application can do. And so even if they're not good metrics, even if they're like, oh yeah, 10% of users convert, you'll have a baseline that you can start to see increment and go up. And so analytics can be a really good way to get that same data that you may be relying on user research too much to get. That being said, I think things like surveys and more asynchronous feedback with your users can also be super valuable. Likewise, don't be afraid to reach out to users and make them feel included in your decision-making process. And so sometimes surveys can feel like this distant opinion of like, oh, I can just just type into this huge text box and it just ends up in someone's inbox. If you reach out and say, we've heard you, like, we know exactly what you're saying, here's what that is on our roadmap, people will feel a lot more engaged and involved, and they'll feel a lot more comfortable scheduling these longer form interviews with you, where like maybe it's 30 minutes or an hour, because they'll see those smaller pieces of engagement as you go. That being said, feel free to work with your sales team and others who maybe have more, concrete day-to-day interactions. And when you're trying to involve those stakeholders, get them to see the value of spending time closer to the development team, because that's going to lead to faster cycle time, building the right thing first, and other types of things that maybe the sales team can then use to pitch to customers who maybe have a more distant relationship with you and your development team. I think those are all different ways of incorporating user feedback into your process. But at the same time, if there's something very specific that maybe you're having a hard time with, we also have VMware Pivotal Labs' office hours. I think there might be a link to somewhere in this webinar world. But if you can't find it, it's also on our website. We're happy to one-on-one consult in these types of situations as well, even for one-off problems like this.
Perfect segue, Denny. I was just going to mention the attachments that we have here below the presentation screen, including the office hours with the VMware Pivotal Labs practitioner. So if you click on that link, it'll just have a little form we can fill out, and you could do some one-on-one consultation with a VMware Pivotal Labs expert. In addition to a lot of great other assets that we've already included in the attachment section. It looks like those are the questions that were asked right now. If you want to continue to ask questions, we can get back to them via email. But Danny, once again, thank you for today's presentation. Thanks to all of you for joining us for today. This event has been recorded and will be available on demand. So please be on the lookout for a post-event email that will have the link in there for you. Danny, thank you. We hope to see you guys at our next event.